First of all, Hannah, thank you so much for coming. We're really excited to have you here at the Longmont Public Library.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And before we dive into the first question, can you give us a little bit more of a brief overview of the story?
I would love to. So American Ghost it's sort of a mix of a biography, a memoir, a history, and a ghost hunting adventure, exploring the life and legend of my great-great-grandmother, Julia Staub, who came from Germany to Santa Fe. She was a Jewish girl from Western Germany, and her husband, Abraham Staub, brought her from Germany to Santa Fe in 1866, in the very early days of Anglo settlement there. And he was a wealthy merchant, and they built a big fancy house there, which is now a big fancy hotel, bigger, fancier hotel. I don't know if it's fancier, but it's bigger, and called La Posada. And since about the late 1970s, there have been stories floating around Santa Fe about her ghost. She's quite famous. She's been on a bunch of television shows. She was on, gosh, I can't remember the name of the show now. She was on one called like Weird Adventures, and she was Unsolved Mysteries was the big one. And so she's sort of a celebrity around Santa Fe. And as a child, I was born in the late 60s. So for my early childhood, I just knew of her as a pioneer. And then when I was a teenager, she became this famous ghost. And of course, I loved it. I loved the story. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I just thought it was so fun to tell my friends that my great-great-grandmother was this ghost in Santa Fe. But I didn't really think much more about her as a person until much later. And so this book is sort of my way of trying to learn about her as a person, as a mother, as a historical figure, rather than this legend and rumor that's been floating around New Mexico for several years.
Well, you write in the book that you've known about your great-great-grandmother, Julia Staub, your entire life. Why did you decide to write about it now? Well,
around the time I had my first child, I was down, I have a bunch of family that's still in New Mexico, and we still have a property that my great-grandfather built, where Julia's daughter Bertha, she married my great-grandfather Max Nordhaus, and they built this house, and I was there. We go there every summer. It's shared by our large extended family, and I was there right after my daughter was born, and I brought her up for a nap in that old house, and I was looking for something to do. There's no internet there, so I couldn't pull out I don't think I even had a smartphone then. I was bored, so I started looking for something to read, and I went to these old leaded glass bookshelves, and I pulled out this old book that was a history of the family written by my great aunt Lizzie. And she wrote it in 1980, shortly before she died. And I must have read it then. I would have been 12 years old then. But I started to read it, and I thought it was just sort of the typical family glorification, and it was nothing like that. And I thought I would read you guys a little section, and go better than I can explain. Well, this is me too, but better than I can do
Hannah, I don't think your mic is on very well.
Okay, thank you. That better? Can you hear me here?
Yes.
That's better? Okay, thank you for telling me that. I'll try to bend down. Okay, so this is when I found Aunt Liz's history. There, Xeroxed and spiral bound, was a tale of a family ecosystem deeply out of balance. Forbidden love, inheritance and disinheritance, anger and madness. There were drug addictions, lawsuits, brother against brother, madhouses, penury, and suicides. There were fatal wounds to the bosom. These were Julia's children. Their story branched from hers. And it was clear to me from Lizzie's book that the family was haunted well before Julia became a ghost. I wondered what had gone so wrong. When I was a younger woman, I imagined Julia to be young as well, struggling as a new bride, frustrated and angry, beset by men. And let me interject here just to say that when I was in my 20s, the very first article I ever published as a journalist was about Julia, and it was it was a story about Julia as a young bride coming to New Mexico and wondering. It was in 1992, the year of the woman, and the article was sort of complaining about how women didn't have it much better now than they did back then. And I very much imagined Julia to be young like me in early 20s, trying to make her way in the world and being put down by the man, who was in this case her husband Abraham. So I'll continue. Now that I was older, Julia seemed to be aging alongside me. So many women's stories trail off in the books and the movies with the happy ending of finding a mate. But I was married now, and I understood that the wedding is only the beginning. I had children of my own, and I knew the terror of having so much to lose. I knew, too, the daily storm and drama of raising children. Motherhood rarely allows for solitude, yet it begets its own kind of isolation. From one's past, from one's youth, from the women we once thought we were and would become. I had, in the years since I'd last written about Julia, gone from heroine to auxiliary. I wondered if this was how Julia had felt. She lived in a time before granite-countered subdivisions colonized the empty land, but no matter the era, certain inevitabilities remain the same. We move unremittingly through life from youth to death. I understood this now. Julia was first an ancestor for me, sepia-toned and indifferent, then a roaming spirit, titillating and abstract. Now I realize she was also a woman, a specific, particular woman who courted and married and emigrated and raised children in a rough and unfamiliar world, and then began to grow old, far from home and family. Her life was real, and it had traversed the same hurdles and milestones, from girlhood to marriage to motherhood to middle age, that I was now passing in my own journey. And as I read in Lizzie's book about her troubled family, I wanted suddenly to understand Julia's journey. How had Julia come to New Mexico? How had she found life there? Had she loved Abraham? Had he loved her? Was he a tyrant? Was she ill, depressed, insane? Did she kill herself? Was she murdered? And also let me interject here that a lot of the ghost stories speculate that she was abused by Abraham and that perhaps he killed her, perhaps she killed herself. There was a talk of a lost baby, that maybe Abraham had killed the baby. So there was a lot of sort of ugly stories swirling around Santa Fe about Julia's life. I wondered about the world that she and Abraham had left behind in Germany, why they had left it, and whether their lives were better in this unforgiving land, a place that nonetheless seemed willing to forgive the fact that they were Jews. I wondered what had happened to those who stayed behind. They were Jews in Germany, after all. Another story that haunts, whole families erased. In her book, Lizzie described a congenital fragility in Julia's offspring, a tendency to nervousness. I wanted to know how the family had suffered and why, and whether my ancestors' afflictions might be prone to seeping down through genes and generations. I didn't think I believed in Julia's ghost, but nonetheless, she was starting to haunt me. So that was sort of the germination of the seeds of this book, and from there I went and sort of tried to figure out how I was going to separate sort of the myth from the historical fact of her life, and I went at it through a lot of very different angles.
So, do you see your story, your book, as a ghost story, a biography, or something else?
I like to call it, it's a history wrapped in ghost story. So the ghost story is why most people care about Julia Staub. Even though she was my ancestress, it's in many ways why I care about Julia Staub. I'm not writing about my other great-great-grandmothers. I'm writing about this one. And nobody else put my other great-great-grandmothers on a TV show. so the ghost story is interesting to people, and her notoriety, it's sort of what's kept her alive to us when so many women have sort of disappeared beneath the documentary crust, beneath the weight of history. And but I'm not a ghosty kind of person, frankly. I'm a journalist, I'm a historian, I'm a just the facts. I'm very skeptical. So part of what I wanted to do as a historian was sort of deconstruct this myth. So I would say someone would describe it as not so much a ghost story as a deconstruction of a ghost story. So I take the ghost story, and that's what makes her life interesting, and then I try to find out what I can actually find out about her life. So I did consult psychics and ghost hunters. One of the psychics is here, Eileen. Hi. And she can tell you lots of things. But most of my research was in archives, newspapers. I was really fortunate that if I had done this book 10 years ago, it would be a totally different book because you couldn't search by name online 10 years ago. Now you can, and fortunately they had a strange name, and they were the only Stavs in New Mexico until like 1920. So I had a lot. I found tons of historical information, read old books from, old journals from the frontier, and let me just explore, sorry. What else did I do? Lots of family oral histories. I interviewed old relatives, lots of very old relatives, a lot of people in their 90s. And then historical photos. I'll show you some of these later. Actually, let me show you one now. This is Julia and Abraham Staub. So this is them sort of as young marrieds. I think she probably already had children by this point, but I'll just so you have an image of her in your head as we talk. So the part that really, like, in terms of professionally and as a writer, the part that really got me going was the history part, and I found a lot more than I thought I was, so I was able to really dig into that history more than I imagined that when I started.
Julia, we learn, sorry if I'm too loud there, was a Jewish German woman who was transplanted to Santa Fe, New Mexico in the 19th century. What would the hardships or even advantages have been for her in this situation?
Well, the hardships were many. It was not, Santa Fe was a rough town back then. She came from a family of, depending on like what family tree you consult, somewhere like 12 to 14 siblings, mostly sisters. She had, I think, 2 or 3 brothers, and then a very close-knit group of sisters. And she was one of the older ones. She was born in 1844. And so at the age of 21, Abraham was actually from her village. The village was called Luchta in Germany. And it's sort of it's in Westphalia. And Abraham left the village when he was 15, came to New York, then traveled the Santa Fe Trail to work for some cousins in Santa Fe. Made a fortune during the Civil War, supplying the Union troops as a dry goods merchant. And then right after the last shot was fired, he went back to find a wife. He was 5 years older than Julia, so she was 21 years old. Came back. It was quite a quick courtship. I don't know, if they remembered each other, they knew each other, if there was a sort of bride shopping period. But he came back. He got a citizenship in July of 1866. Took a ship back to Germany, which would have taken some time, and then found a wife. They married on Christmas Day of 1866, and by January 12th, she was already in New York. So there was not much of a honeymoon. They did travel on a luxury liner, so maybe that was their honeymoon. And then she took the Santa Fe Trail to Santa Fe. At that point, when Abraham traveled it, he was in a wagon. By the time she got there, she was able to do it in a stagecoach. So it was still a 2-week trip, really rough trip. One of the things I did to sort of try to understand the conditions of the Santa Fe Trail was read a lot of old contemporary journals, and there were 2 in particular. There's one by a guy named Hosea Gregg, who was the first person to travel the trail, the first person to write about the trail, and he was there in like the 1830s, 1840s. And then, Susan McGuffin was the first woman who's known to have traveled the trail, and her descriptions of the trail are just brutal. Just like snakes everywhere, storms, mud. It is just not an easy trip. Would have been easier in a stagecoach, but still really rough, jarring. And another account that I read of the trail was Sister Blandina Segale, who was a nun, known as the fastest nun in the West, who is currently a candidate for sainthood. But she wrote about traveling the trail, and she came a couple of years after Julia, also in the wintertime, and she described just jouncing, cold. I mean, when you travel, you don't ever think of that when you're traveling in the winter on a coach. Actually, they don't have glass windows, right? They just had these cloth things, and they'd have them down the whole time. So she was traveling in the dark. So it was really a rough journey. And then she got to Santa Fe, and Santa Fe is an old city. It's 400 years old. So at that time it was 240 years old. But it was nothing like Europe. It was nothing like Germany. It was dry, dusty. It had just been conquered by the Americans in 1846, so it was really a place in flux, lawless, just lots of transients from everywhere trying to get in on this new territory of the United States. So it was really a difficult place for her. So that's the second
awful.
part
I
of the
never
question.
would have made it.
Yeah. No, the advantages. The second part of it. I think there, obviously Abraham made great advantage of his journey to New Mexico. He made himself a rich man. When he died in 1913, he was the richest man in New Mexico, and he provided for my family and my, my great grandmother, my grandfather grew up in great privilege, and so there were a lot of opportunities for the right kind of person. But my suspicion is that Julia was not the kind of person who saw the sort of open world of the American West as a place where she could remake herself. I think she was a fragile person from this close-knit family who was sort of ripped out of her environment and brought into this really hostile new one, and I don't think she was able to handle it very well.
Well, you said she was ripped out, so could you tell us more about Julia's life in Germany? Was life very different in the U.S. when she arrived, and what were relations like between between Jews and Christians in Germany versus Santa Fe?
Yeah, so I guess I should say that another great advantage to moving to New Mexico for them was that it was a much easier place to be a Jewish person. One of the best things I did in researching this was go back and go to Luchta, go to the towns where our family was from, and find the histories of these places. And I was lucky enough to connect with some historians who had written histories of the Jewish people in these villages. And Germany, at that point, it wasn't Germany, it wasn't a unified place, it was all these little provincialities, and the rules might be different from town to town. For instance, when I went back to visit, I went to a town, Bad Pyrmont, which is only 4 kilometers from Luchta, where they came from, and it's this grand spa town, and but it's in Lower Saxony, and Luchta was in Westphalia, so they had totally different rules. And so actually Westphalia was Catholic and Lower Saxony was Protestant. And the Protestant in Lower Saxony, it was much more restrictive on Jews than in Westphalia. And then the towns had their own laws. So it was a little bit easier to be a Jew in Luchta than 4 kilometers away, but nonetheless it was very restrictive. Basically the only thing you could do to make a living was be a merchant or trade horses. And there were all sorts of, I found all these convictions of Jews for doing things like using chalk on a Sunday and slaughtering meat 12 days before the Advent, and just all these, so it was really hard. You had to pay taxes. There were Jew taxes, and every time they came in and out of a town, they had to pay a special Jew tax. And they had to, they paid for the fire brigade. So there wasn't a lot of opportunity there. Nonetheless, some of her family did become quite wealthy, but in Santa Fe, they were Jews there in Germany. And when they came to Santa Fe, they were Americans. They were very much a part of the town. Abraham was really a leader in Santa Fe. He was a county commissioner. He was one of the guys who drove in the Silver Stake when the railroad came to Santa Fe in 1880. So he was also he was very involved in Republican politics there, and he was really they were at the center of things, the whole family, and not on the margins as they were in Germany. So, and that was another advantage. That the disadvantage of that again was that for Julia being ripped out, as we said, the sort of when there aren't that many Jews around and you're not sort of pushed into this one community, there's a real loss of sense of identity.
There are so many histories that you use to understand who Julia Stott was when she was alive. The spiritualist movement history, the Jewish history of the time, the past of the American Southwest, and all these other histories of separate people. What did you find gave the most insight into the mystery of Julia's life?
Well, I guess all of it sort of fed in and gave me this, I just approach it from so many different angles. And I would say the spiritualist, that was more sort of the history of, I was trying to also understand how people thought about ghosts and spirits then. So I think the 2 things that really were most helpful for me, sort of feeling like I'm in her shoes, were the history of the Southwest that I just discussed, the journals from contemporaries who traveled the Santa Fe Trail and came to Santa Fe, and there's all these German, there's a historian in Santa Fe who wrote a history of the Germans in New Mexico, which included Jews and non-Jews. But there was all these German accounts just describing Santa Fe as just this horrible place. You know, it was just so different from Germany. It was so dusty. Germany's green, you know, and it was the houses they thought were ovens. They didn't know, you know, just everything, the architecture, the people, and people were appalled at it. So just getting a sense of what it would be like to be a German and come to Santa Fe in 1866, those histories were really invaluable. The other thing that I found really interesting and not a novelty to me was the history of women's health in the 19th century. Julia was severely depressed, it's pretty clear. And a lot of the ghost stories hint at that she killed herself, that she was, you know, sort of a shut-in her room. A lot of the stories say that she had this baby, Henrietta, in 1883, and then she never left, the baby died, and she never left her room again. So I was very interested in how people treated, trying to find out what was wrong with her and how she would have been treated. And so I, you know, read all these histories of women's health and of mental illness in the 19th century, and it's really just fascinating how, you know, one of the things when she went to Germany, she went to Germany in the early 1890s to be treated. And the first thing she did was, I found a diary of my great-grandmother Bertha's, and she said, you know, got to Berlin and went to see Dr. Olshausen. So God bless the internet, I get on the internet and look up Dr. Olshausen, and there's a doctor, something von Olshausen, who was a pioneer in female reproductive surgery. And he was the first person to successfully do a cesarean, you know, a sort of modern cesarean section, and or I guess modern hysterectomy, sorry. And so she went to see Dr. Olshausen and had a surgery. And so I thought, oh, okay, well, her problems are, she had some sort of woman problem. But then, you know, I kept reading, and it was the way they treated mental illness was the same way they treated reproductive problems among 19th century women. So if a woman was depressed, they give her a hysterectomy, and, you know, and this is something that's sort of way back beyond the 19th century, but, you know, Plato said that the hystera, the Greek word for hysteria, and hysterectomy are from the same word, from the same root. So that was really that just sort of twisted my mind around and made me realize, like, that this poor woman, just all these barbaric treatments that she went through. After the surgery, she went and did a water cure where you drink 64 glasses of water in 2 hours, and then, you know, you get a chamber to pee it all out afterwards. But it was just to be someone with poor health, be it mental or physical, in that era must have been every bit as hard as traveling the Santa Fe Trail.
I was totally struck by the things that women especially had to endure in your story, and it was just amazing. We have come a long way, even though sometimes it doesn't feel that way.
And here I want to show you a couple of pictures before we move on. So this is her, I suspect this is her bridal photo. They didn't marry in white back then. But this is the first photo we have of her, which is very young. And I wanted to show you a picture of Santa Fe in that era. This is Burrow Alley. This is where she lived, that street. So Burrow Alley now, if you go there to Santa Fe now, it's very, you know, it's paved. There's no burrow. There's a iron burrow there, a statue. But this was like the Santa Fe's red light district gambling, and then it had the donkey and burro market there. And when she first moved to Santa Fe in 1866, they did not move into the fancy house that is now La Posada. They moved to Burrow Alley, and they lived in the adobe home there until she had almost all of her children. They didn't move to the house until 1882. So this is where she came from this lovely little town in Germany. And I also, speaking of the Jewish thing, I wanted to show you this photo because this is speaking of how different the Jewish experience was in New Mexico from Germany. This is, the middle guy is Abraham's brother Zadok Staub, who he came first. He came a couple of years before Abraham. They worked for their cousins, the Spiegelbergs. The other two guys are two of the Spiegelbergs. I think actually one might be a Seldman. There's a Spiegelberg, and they're all Jewish merchants, and these are Kiowa scouts on the Santa Fe Trail. I suspect it was a posed photo, but you know, you don't get that on the Lower East Side in Manhattan. So it's really a different history than Jews in Germany or New York. So
So now we're going to talk about Julia haunting what is now a very popular hotel in Santa Fe, La Posada. Did you find that this made it harder to get in contact with her?
The haunting made
The
it harder.
Yeah.
So this is the house that is now La Posada. La Posada is sort of an adobe structure that's built around the original house. You walk into the reception area, which is the adobe structure, and then you walk through the sort of house, you check in, or you go to the bar, and you walk up the stairs to the house. Not that porch there anymore. So this is the place she haunts, and see those two windows to the left of the porch there on the second floor. That's her room. That's the place the rooms she's supposed to haunt. So
Now there was a fire on the third floor.
So
did the third floor go away?
Yes, the third floor's gone. Yeah, and I believe there was an addition. I can't quite. You're reading the reports. I can't quite figure out which part of the original house. I mean, what burned. So there was a third floor. They say that was a ballroom. And then I think there was a back addition, and that's what burned. So the back addition of the ballroom, and somehow this original part survived, sort of miraculously. It was like however many alarms they had in Santa Fe at the time, they were all fighting the fire all night in 1921 to save it. It had become a boarding house at that point. My family didn't own it anymore. So in terms of getting in touch with Julia, I think, I feel very connected to her through the history part, but it didn't tell me how she felt and how she lived her life in some ways. And, I had all these newspaper accounts. She went to a party here. I had the diary of her daughter. So I had these little tidbits. So it was almost like a skeleton of her life. I knew the major events. And so in many ways, with the psychics and trying to connect with her, that allowed me, I don't know if I connected with her personally. I'd like to think I did, but it sort of helped me connect to her emotionally, and sort of like it added flesh to the bones. So whether, the people that I spoke to told me that, she sat in a rocking chair and clasped her hands, and that she loved her children, and all these things that just made me feel more connected to her story, and more, it rounded her out and made her whole to me in a way.
So you visited with many psychics and spiritualists, which you call them that in the book, which I found very fascinating, because most of us wouldn't think to go that direction. But since she's not in the physical, I suppose that's a good reason for trying someone who could connect with her.
Well, I didn't see how I could tell. I mean, the reason I'm writing the story, to go back to the history wrapped in the ghost story, the reason I'm writing the story is because she's a famous ghost. So I didn't see how I could just ignore that. And, and from a perspective of being taken seriously and my own comfort zone, it would have been easier to do. But it just seemed like I was curious. I wanted to... the way I wrote the book, I sort of separated it out from the historical, and then I had these sort of interludes where I meet with various psychics and ghost hunters and stuff like that. And that sort of, I have the sort of the historical Julia and then the imagined Julia. Whether or not, I'm sure that a lot of people the people I spoke with didn't feel that they imagined her, but the sort of the Julia that lives in our minds versus the Julia that lived in the history books and in the newspapers. And so that was, I just sort of felt like, how could I tell this story and explore her life without looking at both sides of that story?
Which I'm really glad you did, because to me it added a whole other dimension. And I have a good friend who's one of those people, so that helped too. You write on page 104, the more I dug, the less I knew. What do you think was the reason why you felt this way?
Well, so even obviously, I would see one psychic, they'd tell me one thing, I'd see another one, they'd tell me another thing. So obviously, the stories, the rumors, of course they're gonna contradict each other, and sometimes, but even the history, when I started digging deeper into the history, I'd find things that contradicted each other, and in the particular instance in which I'm writing, so Abraham around the time Abraham built his house, the Archbishop of Santa Fe, Jean-Baptiste Lamy, who they all call Laney down in Santa Fe, Laney was finishing his cathedral, the famous Santa Fe Cathedral. They were two of the largest brick structures, the very first brick structures in Santa Fe, in this town made of adobe, made of blood. And so the story goes that the Archbishop was, if you ever read Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather, a classic book, tells of his struggles, also as a European, sort of cultured European coming to New Mexico. And he was friends with our family, and it also, his life's work was to build the cathedral in Santa Fe. And I wish I had a picture of it, but I do not. It's just a lovely sort of little big brick structure right in the heart of downtown. And so he struggled to build it. He ran out of money a number of times. And at one point, the story goes that, the story I had always been told was that he was playing poker with Abraham, my great-great-grandfather, and he was looking sort of downtrodden, and Abraham said, "What's the problem?" He said, "I'll never live to see the cathedral completed." And Abraham said, "Don't worry about it, I'll give you the money." And so, when you go on a tour of Santa Fe, the tour guides always say, well, they say it's a cathedral in the bottom half and a synagogue on top. And if you, at the cathedral, there are 4 Hebrew letters on the archway, the entrance keystone called Yahweh, the Hebrew words for God, and it said that was what Abraham asked for in exchange. So I'd always heard the story. They say it on the tours, it's in the books, and then as I started reading more and more, I got on the internet, I'm finding all these articles, I found this historian who concluded that wasn't what had happened, and that either, that the Hebrew words were actually a tradition in Europe, and that it was either a coincidence or the Archbishop did it just to make the Jews feel like they had contributed. And he found no records that Abraham had given him any money. And so I just got very confused by this. I ultimately concluded that I do think that he helped, that he did fund it. I found more information, but I just kept finding all this contradictory information. Or for instance, Abraham's, I never figured out when he came to America. 1854, I'd look at one citizenship application and it would say 1854, and then a passport application said 1856. His obituary said something else. So even the facts aren't as solid, and then you get into all the ghost stuff, and just there's nothing really grasping at wisps.
So it makes us wonder how much of the rest of history is really, really accurate. Doesn't it make you wonder?
Yeah, truth that is over here. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Would you be willing to talk about the fact that you had a DNA test as well?
Yes. So my family had always joked. So it was clear that Stobbs and the Archbishop were close, and how close was always a source of speculation in my family. There's a historian named Paul Horgan he won the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Archbishop Lamy. He also wrote a book called The Centuries of Santa Fe, and in the book he writes, there's chapters and sort of different eras of Santa Fe's history, and these sort of weird, half fictional, half non-fiction chapters based on these sort of archetypal characters from various epics of Santa Fe. And one chapter was called The German Bride, and it was based on Julia. There was 2. It was based on Julia's life, and it talks about her close rapport with the Archbishop. And my grandmother then wrote sort of an essay about being a young. She had come from Rhode Island and Bronxville, New York, to New Mexico, also as a young bride. Being a young bride, sort of out of place, and she speculated that Julia and the Archbishop had a thing. And so my family used to joke that we were actually descended from the Archbishop, and that they should write a book called Love Comes for the Archbishop. Ripped bodices and lipstick stains and stuff like that. So my dad, sort of jokingly said, you should get a DNA test and see if we're actually descended from the Archbishop. So since I was going to trying to approach it from every angle, I said, why not? Let's look at the genetics of it too. So I got a DNA test. Totally did not think that that Archbishop Lamy is my great-great-grandfather. But when my results came back, I actually was missing some Jewishness. I should be 75% Jewish. I'm 3/4 Jewish. And my test came back and said I was 68%. Actually, it said I was 60% Jewish, but margin of error plus or minus 9%. So I said, well, it's got to be more. What's margin of error up to 69%? And so I'm missing 6%. And then I called this very famous genetic she does all the PBS genetic shows, and asked her, like, what's the deal with this? This is a little weird. She said, well, get a second test, and if that confirms it, then maybe you're onto something. So then the first test was with family tree DNA, and I got a test with 23andMe. And that one said I was 68.75% Jewish, which is, again, I'm missing 6.25%, which is exactly the amount of genes that would be contributed by a great grandparent. And it also said I was French, both of them. So suddenly it didn't seem, there's no way I can trace my, presumably, unless my ancestors count, the Archbishop didn't have any kids. To trace, it's sort of complicated, but to trace genes to a male back in history, you have to trace through the male line. But Abraham had no males. Abraham had male survivors, but they didn't have any kids. So there's no way I could trace it through the actual Y chromosome. So this was as close as I could get the autosomal DNA, which is just like, you're this much this, and you come from here. But I will say, and this is since the book came out, suddenly all my results have changed. So now it says, if I go to 23andMe, it says I'm 72% Jewish. And Family Tree changed too. So I don't know if there's something with the testing or with, it's all about the database and how many people they're testing against. So this too is lost to history. Everything else.
Do you consider the more recent findings more accurate?
I don't think I misended from the Archbishop.
Okay.
So, yeah, this makes more sense to me.
Now you've heard the real word.
Yes.
Now we're going to change the subject again. Julia's daughters seem to fare quite well in their adult lives, but her sons had more struggles. What do you think accounts for this difference?
Well, let me show you. So I'll show you some, there's a daughter. So my great grandmother is the one on the right there. That's Bertha, and this is Delia on the left with the glasses. Julia had 7 children who survived. First 3 were girls, and the first 4 were boys. And the first 3 were, so she had Anna in 1866, and Delia in 1868, Bertha in 1870, and then there was a little break, and then she had 4 boys in quick succession, all within a year of each other. First one was disabled, his name was Paul, and then she had Arthur, and then Julius, and then Teddy, and I'll show you Teddy. And Teddy is the only one that my ancestors remember. Actually, they remember Delia too. Delia and Teddy lived beyond World War II, and my father and my aunts and uncles remember them. He died actually like 3 months after I was born in 1968, in his 90s. But the boys had it rough, and I think there were two reasons. I think, first of all, childbirth was very hard on Julia, and it's pretty clear she suffered from some postpartum, depression or postpartum depression. But she was not only did she have these 7 children, but she had the one that she lost in 1883, Henrietta, and then it said that she had a lot of miscarriages as well. So she was pretty much constantly pregnant for her entire adulthood, pretty much. And I think by the time she got to the boys, there wasn't much left for them. And then the other thing is, I think that Abraham, the girls weren't expected to go create themselves and succeed the way their father had. So in Bertha's diary, she describes him as being much more, he sounded like sort of a nice dad. They had fun together. He was strict, but he was funny, and they did things together. But I got a real sense there was, after Abraham's death, he disinherited one of his sons, and his son later sued the other brothers trying to get some money from them. And all this stuff came out in this court case about just how harsh Abraham was to the sons. And he sort of picked a profession. He said, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a lawyer. So Paul was disabled, he never did anything professionally. Arthur ran the family business, Julius was a lawyer, and he did all the legal work for the family business. And then Teddy became a doctor and took care of Abraham. And then the minute Abraham died, then Julius died, left all his money to Teddy, and Teddy never worked again. Clearly, he had been a pediatrician, but he took care of Abraham, and then he went off and dealt Renaissance tapestries for the rest of his life. He became an art dealer. But I get the sense that having this sort of self-made father in that era, there wasn't a lot of affection, and there were high expectations and not a lot of nurturing that went on for the boys.
Towards the end of the book, you leap forward in time to tell the story of Julia's sister, Emily, who perished in the Holocaust. Why did you decide to include that story in the book?
Let me, this is Wolfgang Muller. He is my, let's see, I think he was my third cousin. He was my grandfather's cousin. He was so Julia, as I mentioned, came from a large family of a lot of sisters. He was the grandson of the youngest sister, and so he actually, he died while I was writing the book, but I was able to interview him. And when I first started researching, the first thing I did was went to my Aunt Betsy's house and she's sort of the family archivist, and went through all these most of these photos come from her. And I found this letter from Wolfgang Muller, who had come, saying he had come to New Mexico in 1936 to escape the Nazis. My great-grandfather, Max Nordhaus, had brought him over, and he worked for the family business. And so he had written to my family saying, oh, I have these fond memories of New Mexico. He was living in Washington, D.C. at that point. And so I called him, and it turned out that he was the grandson of Amelia, Julia's youngest sister. And I learned that she had had the misfortune to live long enough. She was young so much. Julia died in 1896, but Amelia lived long enough to die in a concentration camp. And so this is 50 years after Julia's death, but I felt like when you trying to tell a history of German Jews, sort of every story ends in the Holocaust. It's the ultimate Jewish ghost story. In many ways, it's the story that haunts us all. And so I always had assumed that I had relatives who had died in the Holocaust, but I had not. I didn't have any names. I didn't have any stories. I didn't have any real connection. And Wolfgang sort of provided me with that connection. And so my mother and I, my mother speaks German. She was my translator when we went to Germany. And when we went there, we first went to Longmont, and then we went to Paderborn, which is about 40 minutes away from by car, and it's where my great-grandfather grew up and where Wolfgang grew up, and they had known each other, the families had known each other in Paderborn, and that's why he brought him over. But after that, and I went and I visited all the sites where my family, a lot of Julia's siblings had moved to Paderborn. And so I went around with a historian, and she showed me the department store that they owned, and then the Nazis had taken it from them. And Amelia had owned a mill. I'll show you a picture of Amelia. That's her. That's the old woman there holding the baby. Is Amelia. Their family had owned a mill. They were very wealthy. The mill was called. It was the Rosenthal mill. Her husband, Louis Rosenthal, died before the Nazis took over. She ran the mill herself for many years. She had a manager named Karl Schumann. And she brought him in as a business partner, and it was called Rosenthal and Schumann. And then the Nazis took over, and they changed the name to Schumann and Rosenthal because Jews weren't allowed to own businesses. Then they changed the name to Schumann and Co., and then they just took the business from her, and they took her house. And she ended up living in Paderborn in a Jewish orphanage that she had funded for a time. And then she ultimately, I don't think I have pictures here, but she ended up in Theresienstadt, also Terezin, which is a Czech concentration camp. It was not a death camp, but it was, a lot of people died there, including Amelia. She died there January 1st, 1943. And it was the camp where they brought artists and the elderly because the Nazis had, probably a lot of you know about Theresienstadt. I somehow did not know about it until I found out I had a relative who had died there. The Nazis, claimed that all the concentration camps were work camps, and you couldn't send an 80-year-old woman to a work camp, right? So they said, oh, well, this is the elderly ghetto where we're going to put them, and it's a retirement community. And so there was a lot of starvation. They said she died. Wolfgang had said she died from exposure. I actually found her death certificate, and it said she died of enterocolitis. They were very precise. So that was obviously it's a story that really haunts me still, and I just didn't see how I could not tell that story.
I loved hearing about that story because there was such a contrast between the way they had been living before the Nazis and the way their lives ended. It was so sad.
Yes, and so in this is I'll show you. This is the first page of Bertha's diary. In Bertha's diary, so this is 1891 to 1893. She goes to Germany with her family. That's when Julia gets a hysterectomy and she takes the water cure. But they're going from like elegant spa to elegant spa, and they visit their family, and they just lived in such grandeur. They'd all done well. They were a wealthy family from this little village. And by the 1890s, Germany was unified. They lifted the restrictions on the Jews. Jews were serving in Parliament. They had done really well. They opened all these big department stores, and I always got the sense about Julia that she felt terribly unlucky to have been ripped out of that life, that having come to New Mexico from Germany was the worst stroke of misfortune she could have suffered. And then to know she died in 1896, she didn't have the benefit of historical hindsight like we do, to know what happened Amelia was the only one who lived long enough to die in the Holocaust, but a lot of their nieces and nephews were killed as well. Amelia's two sons died with her. Well, they went with her to Theresienstadt, and daughter-in-law, and then they were sent to Auschwitz. So, and there was dozens of descendants of that family. So, what we construe as good fortune during our lifetimes can be seen very differently 50 years later.
How did the experience of investigating the life of your great-great-grandmother affect you personally?
It affected me in so many ways. I think the main thing it made me realize is, to get back to this issue of fortune and misfortune, is just how lucky I am to be born when I was as a woman, to have the opportunities I've had, to have the constitution that I have, Julia, in addition to not having the greatest experience in life, she was wealthy. It wasn't horrible for her, but she was emotionally very fragile and not very resilient. So just to be able to sort of, I think the lesson she really taught me was to understand my good fortune and to remember it. Yes, to remember it and to make the most of it.
I really got that feeling after having read the whole book. What is the one thing that you hope readers will take away from American Ghost?
I guess just that, every story, every house. So we'll go back to Julia's to the house here. Every house has a story. Every brick, Once I started digging into this history of New Mexico and my family, everybody has a past, and it's so close if you just you can almost reach out and grab it. And I think my family is better documented than many, but I think everybody has this, I think if you have the leisure, I had the resources to dig. I was going to be paid by my publisher to write this book, but the stories are there, and the past is, you walk by all these buildings and all these streetlights, Abraham paid for the gasification of New Mexico, there's a history to all these places, and it's a lot more than we realize, and there's people behind all these places. So I think that's the just exploring one's family in the past. There's just and every ghost story has a real story behind it that's probably worth telling.
Well, shall we open it up to
Sure.
our audience? If you have a question, you're going to have to say it really loud.
When men had mental illness, what portion of their anatomy was removed?
They did do, one of the things I read about was the rest cure, because women, there was this thing, neurasthenia, right? Your nerves are overwrought. And hysteria tended to be a women's thing. But men did, they took the cure too, and they did not have hysterectomies or the male equivalent. They weren't castrated, but it was, there were all sorts of crazy cures, and men did take some of them as well. But I think women, it was more, women were so sort of coddled and contained, and so if they did suffer from mental illness, it was you sort of locked them away. That was what you did. They had to rest, and they weren't allowed to. There's that I quote in the book. Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote this very famous story, "The Yellow Wallpaper," that was based on her own experiences with the rest cure, where the doctors wouldn't let her read books. You know, she wasn't allowed to expend herself in any way because it would make her overwrought. I think she suffered depression after the birth of her child, and finally she realized that what was going to make her happy was to leave her husband. That's what she did.
And she instantly got well.
She did actually. I think she was pretty yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I haven't finished the book, and I don't know if you go over this or not, but from what I'm hearing is there's no haunting until the 70s.
That
she
I know.
died in the late 1800s. Why is the time span? What's the time span?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so she was wanting to know if Julia died in 1896, but the first report of her ghost sighting is until the 1970s. Why? There's that big gap. And so I looked back, and the first time there was a ghost mentioned a couple of times. There was something I think it was in the 60s. There was a ghost at La Posada. They think it's a housemaid named Ida. And then starting it was 1978 was the first story I could find that said there's a ghost at La Posada. Her name is Julia, and here's how she died, or here's why she's a ghost. So obviously, since I wasn't able to speak to her, I mean I did in some ways, but you could there's some people thought that around that time that the building was renovated, it had been modernized over the years, and around that time it was renovated to return to sort of this Victorian grandeur. They pulled up, they fixed up the parquet floors and the molding and stuff like that. And so some people say it was the renovation that sort of awakened her. And then, if you're more of the skeptical sort, you might say this is Victoriana. This was like sort of the height of the Victorian craze. It was about 100 years after Victorian stuff had gone out of style. So sort of we're all into mid-century modern now. Or I guess it was like 75 years. So perhaps like Victorian, everybody's into all things Victorian, and so Victorian ghosts, people were more aware of that. But I don't know the answer to many things. Yeah.
What is your personal sense of, what's your personal sense? It's also very hard to hear you back here still now. What's your personal sense of how Julia's ghost is now? Is she at rest? Is she still there? What's your personal sense of where her spirit is?
Well, I'm looking at, I actually, one of the spiritualists I spoke with in my book is Eileen, who's here, and I actually met with her today. I've actually had 3 people write me in the last 2 weeks who, after the book came out, people contacted me and said, I met your great-grandmother. When I was a child, she came to me. And some people have never been to La Posada. Some people have met her at La Posada, or said they had met her at La Posada. But in the last 3 weeks, 3 people have come to me and said, oh, Julia's been talking to me. And Eileen was one of them, and I spoke with Eileen today, and she said she actually went to La Posada a couple of weeks ago, and said she was still there, and they had some communication.
Almost a dozen hours.
Yes, they spent 12 hours communicating, and then and she said that she encouraged her to let go. So my personal feeling, but in my book there's someone else who, Jane's friend Judith, who also encouraged her to let go. But so I don't know. If I knew, then I would. I guess people ask me, do I believe in ghosts? That's sort of and I some of the stories that I've heard since writing this book have been so uncanny, it's hard not to believe. But if I knew for sure there are or aren't ghosts, I would elect me president. How can I know what happens after death? So I can only listen to what people tell me, and so I guess my gut is totally unsatisfying answer, for which I apologize. Yeah.
Do you have any idea how long it was steamship might have taken from Germany to New York? And
Yes.
the second question is, were the German Jews pretty much known to be persecuted during during that time, 1840s, 1850s? Were they known? Is that why some maybe Jews they left Germany to come to America?
Yeah, so the steamship, yes, I found the steam, with the help of another woman who's in this book, a woman, Lynn, who's sort of a genealogist, but also had some personal experiences with Julia at the hotel. She helped me. I had never been on Ancestry.com, but I'm sure a lot of you guys have now, as have I. It's this wonderful genealogy site where you can search, records, immigration records, death, birth, Social Security, that kind of thing, or not Social Security, census. And so I found the ship's log of the ship that she came on. It was on the Cunard line, and it was the RMS Scotia. And so then I looked up the Scotia, and it was a luxury. It was the fastest ship on the Atlantic at the time. It was only first class cabins. It was very grand, and it took 9 days to get across. So I was envisioning months, but it was 9 days. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, literally, she married Christmas Day, and she disembarked in New York on January 12th. And she had to get to I think she went Bremen to Liverpool. The Scotia went from Liverpool.
And so, do you know if the German Jews were being persecuted at that time? Is that why they left Germany?
In that era, so my first relative, ancestor, who came over was Solomon Spiegelberg, who was Abraham's first cousin. And so, and I'm pretty sure the guy on the right that's not Solomon. Solomon actually went over, made a bunch of money, came back like even before Julia got there. But he brought his 5 brothers over. And so I think that's Levi Spiegelberg. And he came sometime in the 1840s, but he was a settler, he was a merchant who provided for the troops with the Army battalion that conquered Santa Fe. So that was 1846. So I started looking into what was happening in Germany in the 1840s. And not just for Jews. So German Jews were persecuted, it came in waves of, there'd be sort of pogroms, and then they'd be fine for a while, and then there'd be a famine or some sort of destabilization, and they'd get blamed for it, or they'd be blamed, a plague, and they'd be blamed for killing babies or something like that. And so they just, they'd do well for a while, then they'd be driven out of the town, and then they do well. So, but Julia's family had been in Luchna since the 18th century, or maybe 17th century, all the way through. So there was some stability there, but the 1840s was a time of real turmoil for Germany in general, not just for Jews. And anytime there was turmoil, the Jews sort of got the worst of it.
But there was turmoil, was it?
There was a revolution, a failed revolution. In 1848, there was a bunch of famines, sort of back-to-back, really bad crop years. So there's this huge wave of migration in the 1840s. The other thing that did not make the book, but I still hope to write about it someday, I was like, well, why, the Santa Fe Trail, right? A lot of Germans came to Missouri. Why did they end up in Missouri? And I found this history of Germans in New Mexico mentioned a book by a guy named Gottfried Duden, who was he came to the Missouri River Valley in the 1820s and wrote this book about the splendors of Missouri, and all the pigs were tame, and the corn whiskey tasted like the finest French brandy, and the women never swore. It was just so I had this long section in the book, and everybody's like, you gotta get rid of this. It's just way too off topic. Not that I didn't go off topic a million times anyway, but they were like, this is just a bridge too far. So Gottfried Duden came back, wrote a book about the splendors of the Missouri River Valley, and it was a huge bestseller in Germany. And there are all these Duden societies that were formed in Germany and Switzerland, and all these Germans came to Missouri, and so that was sort of they were sort of primed to emigrate already, and then this sort of really rough period economically, famines, and politically happened in the 1840s in Germany, and so that was sort of the push. The pull was sort of the Duden glories of Missouri, and the push was the famine and the revolution. And So a bunch of people ended up in St. Louis, and then Solomon Spiegelberg ended up working for a German merchant house that started flying the Santa Fe Trail when the U.S. conquered it and conquered Santa Fe in 1846. So I mean, the Santa Fe Trail had opened up before that, but so that's sort of the New Mexico, the Germany to New Mexico connection that I made was through this sort of 1840s turmoil of Germans coming to St. Louis.
And then Abraham's brother came first, right?
His brother came first, and Abraham actually went to Norfolk, Virginia, for a couple of years, and I could find nothing on that. But he apparently worked for a merchant house there. I'm assuming probably for family. Zadok, his brother, came earlier, went across the Santa Fe Trail, started working for the Spiegelbergs, and Abraham followed him. They worked for their cousins for 2 years, and then started their own business called Z. Staub and Brother. And then then Zadok moved back to New York. So Abraham held up the New Mexico arm of the business, and Zadok brought up his family in New York.
Thank you.
Let's see if there's any other photos here. Okay, here's a picture of Julia, sort of an older picture. This one I love. She just looks so haunted there. And then I thought I'll end with a story about, these are my parents. And this is Julia's room. And this is the night I had my book party. After my book came out in 2015, they had a big party at La Posada, and they were giving tours of the room. And we went up after the party was over. We all went up and did a tour. And my parents had never stayed there before. We'd all been to the room. So they had set up in one of the casitas on the property, and they said, the room's open, why don't you guys stay there? So this is them as their sort of American Ghost Gothic photo before they went to bed. And that night, so we all went to sleep, and the next morning we all met for breakfast, and I asked them, did anything happen in the room? And my mom said, wait, I want to get it straight. So my mom said, no, nothing happened, but I didn't sleep at all. So the room is above the bar. It's like if you want to sleep, it's the worst possible place to stay. If you want to be up all night thinking about ghosts, it's a great place to stay. But it's really loud. So she said, no, I was up all night going to the bathroom, back and forth. And then I said, well, Dad, did you see anything? He said, actually, I did. I saw a woman in a white nightgown. Julia's often seen in sort of Victorian dress or sort of white nightgown robes. So I saw a woman in a white nightgown. She was going back and forth between the bathrooms. Mystery solved.
Well, this has just been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.